Keep your hands where I can see them. Step back.
Why am I being searched?
Turn around.
I didn't.
Turn around. Stop moving. Hands behind your back.
Hands where I can see them. Step back. Turn around. The command sliced through the quiet night air like a warning siren. A tall man in a black hoodie froze beside his car, the beam of a police flashlight cutting across his face. His voice, calm but edged with disbelief, broke the silence. "Why am I being searched, officer?" The policeman didn't answer. His tone was sharp, rehearsed, the kind of authority that came from habit, not necessity. "Stop moving. Hand behind your back." A second flashlight flickered from the patrol car, illuminating the shiny surface of a black Mercedes parked under a streetlight. The wet asphalt reflected blue and red from the police cruiser, painting the scene in chaos and color. A body cam blinked silently, recording everything. Those few moments, routine for one man and humiliating for another, would soon spark headlines across the nation. What looked like an ordinary stop would expose the kind of truth most people only whisper about, the kind that shakes trust from the inside out. It was 10:38 p.m. when Officer Neil Crawford spotted the Mercedes turn onto Maple Avenue. The neighborhood was empty, quiet except for the hum of streetlights and the low rhythm of rain tapping against his windshield. Crawford, in his late 20s, was a man who took his badge seriously, maybe a little too seriously. He'd only been on the force for 5 years, but he already carried himself like a veteran. Some said it was confidence. Others called it arrogance. The Mercedes caught his attention as it drifted slightly across the lane. To Crawford, it was enough. He turned on his lights and siren. The vehicle slowed quickly, pulling neatly to the curb. No chase, no delay, just obedience. But to Crawford, even that seemed suspicious. Inside the car, Edmund Williams exhaled slowly. He had spent 26 years enforcing the law, and now, it seemed, he was about to experience it from the other side. He wasn't in uniform tonight. He had left the station hours ago, after attending a community meeting about improving trust between police and citizens. Ironically, those very words, trust and community, were printed on the notes still resting on the passenger seat beside him. He placed both hands on the steering wheel, as every officer was trained to do, and waited. The rain thickened, streaking down the windshield in silver threads. He watched through the mirror as the young officer approached, hand already on his holster, the other gripping a flashlight. "Evening, officer," Edmund said quietly as the beam of light hit his face. "Is there a problem?" Crawford ignored the greeting. "License and registration," he said flatly. Edmund nodded. "Of course. My license is in my wallet, and my registration's in the glove box." "I'm reaching slowly." Crawford stepped back slightly, still tense. "Go ahead." Edmund moved carefully, keeping every motion visible. Years of experience told him how quickly misunderstanding could turn into tragedy. He handed over the documents, his expression steady, patient. Crawford returned to his patrol car and ran the information. The computer screen flashed the name instantly. Edmund Williams, Chief of Police. But Crawford wasn't paying attention. He typed too quickly, distracted by the sound of distant thunder and his own sense of control. He glanced back at the Mercedes, suspicion still clouding his judgment. When he walked back to the car, his tone was clipped. "You failed to signal when changing lanes." Edmund nodded. "My mistake. I must have overlooked it." But Crawford wasn't satisfied. Something about the man's calm composure irritated him. Most people stammered, argued, or tried to explain themselves. This one didn't. It was as if he wasn't intimidated, as if he'd seen this 1,000 times before. "Step out of the vehicle," Crawford ordered. Edmund blinked. "Excuse me." "You heard me," Crawford said, more firmly this time. "Out of the car." It wasn't standard for a traffic violation, and both men knew it. Edmund hesitated, not out of defiance, but disbelief. "Officer," he said slowly, "is there a reason you're escalating this?" Crawford's grip tightened around his flashlight. "Sir, don't make this harder than it has to be. Step out." The air between them thickened. The sound of rain drowned out everything else. The city, the hum of streetlights, the ticking clock on the dashboard. Edmund finally pushed the door open and stepped outside, tall and calm, under the harsh red-blue glow. What happened next lasted less than 20 seconds, but it would replay endlessly on screens across the country. The young officer barked orders, too fast, too forceful, and the older man's patience met the breaking point of authority. Crawford reached first, grabbing Edmund's wrist. The move was automatic, drilled into muscle memory. But in that single moment, power, pride, and fear collided. The body cam never blinked. It watched as two officers, one seasoned by decades of service, the other hardened by inexperience, became part of a story neither would ever escape. And before the night was over, the city would know the truth. The man on the pavement wasn't just any suspect. He was the chief of police himself. What began as a simple traffic stop was about to ignite a storm that no badge could contain. Edmund Williams had given nearly his entire adult life to the badge. 26 years of service, from a rookie fresh out of the academy to a seasoned detective, a respected captain, and finally, chief of police. He had seen it all: riots, corruption scandals, political pressure, and good officers burned out by the system. Through it all, he had remained calm, just, and disciplined. His officers often said, "The chief doesn't raise his voice, he raises the standard." That night, though, Edmund wasn't a chief, a leader, or a symbol of authority. He was just a weary man heading home after a long community safety meeting. He had spent the evening discussing better policing, transparency, accountability, and training officers to de-escalate situations instead of igniting them. Ironically, the very principles he had been advocating for were about to be tested against him in the most unexpected way. The streets were quiet as he drove through the suburbs. It was late, and the air carried the kind of stillness that comes only after a light rain. His Mercedes hummed softly as he turned onto the main road. He wore no uniform, just a black hoodie and faded jeans. To anyone passing by, he looked like any middle-aged man returning home after a long day. A few blocks behind him, Officer Neil Crawford sat in his patrol car, sipping lukewarm coffee. He was 29 years old, sharp, fit, and ambitious. But beneath that ambition was a temper that had gotten him in trouble before. His supervisors knew he was aggressive. 2 complaints for excessive force had already crossed their desks. Each time, the cases had been quietly closed, dismissed for lack of sufficient evidence. Crawford had learned the wrong lesson, that he could get away with pushing boundaries. When he noticed the black Mercedes switch lanes without signaling, he saw an opportunity, or perhaps an excuse. He flicked on his lights. Red and blue reflected off the wet asphalt. Finally, something to break the boredom, he muttered to himself. Edmund saw the lights in his rearview mirror. His first instinct wasn't fear, it was habit. He had trained hundreds of young officers on how to conduct a stop. He knew every step, every command, every possible outcome. He slowed the car, pulled neatly to the curb, turned off the engine, and rolled down his window. Both hands rested on the wheel, fingers spread, visible, calm, composed, predictable. When Crawford stepped out of his cruiser, the sound of his boots echoed across the empty street. His flashlight beam hit Edmund's mirror, then swept over the car. "Evening," he said flatly, though there was no warmth in his tone. "Good evening, officer," Edmund replied, voice steady. "Is there a problem?" "License and registration," Crawford said. His tone wasn't rude, but it carried that edge of authority that often came when an officer wanted to assert control. "Of course," Edmund replied. "My license is in my wallet, and the registration's in the glove box. I'll move slowly." "Go ahead," Crawford said, still watching him closely. Edmund retrieved both documents carefully and handed them over. Crawford didn't thank him, just turned away and walked back to his patrol car, scanning the papers with one hand while typing into the system with the other. The screen flashed instantly. Edmund Williams, Chief of Police, City of Greenwood. If Crawford had been paying attention, he might have noticed. But in that moment, he wasn't focused on the details. He was focused on the control, the power dynamic. He glanced toward the Mercedes again, jaw tightening. Something about the calm, polite man in the car rubbed him the wrong way. There was no fear, no nervousness, just patience. And in Crawford's mind, patience often meant defiance. He slammed the door, walked back toward the car, and stopped beside the driver's window. "You failed to signal when you changed lanes," he said stiffly. Edmund nodded. I must have missed it. My apologies." Crawford's face remained unreadable. The silence stretched uncomfortably long before he spoke again. "Step out of the vehicle." Edmund looked up, surprised. "For a turn signal violation?" Crawford's voice hardened. "Step out of the car, sir." Edmund took a slow breath. "Officer, with respect, I've complied with everything you've asked. My paperwork is clean, and I haven't." "I said step out." Crawford interrupted, louder this time, hand resting near his holster. For a moment, Edmund just stared at him. He had trained men like Crawford before, men who mistook aggression for strength, who thought raising their voice proved control. He could see the tension in the young man's shoulders, the impatience in his stance. And even though Edmund outranked him by decades, that meant nothing right now. The uniform dictated the power, and at this moment, Edmund was just another civilian. He unbuckled his seatbelt and slowly opened the door. The air outside was cool, carrying the faint scent of rain and asphalt. As he stood up, he made sure his hands were visible. "There's really no need for this," he said quietly. Crawford stepped back, flashlight still fixed on him. "Turn around and face the car." Edmund's brows furrowed. "Officer, may I ask why?" The command came sharper now. "Face the car." The tension in the air thickened. The quiet street suddenly felt heavy, like time itself was holding its breath. Edmund realized this wasn't about a traffic stop anymore. It was about something far bigger: ego, authority, and the dangerous line between control and abuse. He did as told, every movement deliberate, careful. He wasn't just protecting himself now. He was testing everything he had ever believed about justice, restraint, and the system he had sworn to defend. And in that moment, neither man knew that the camera on Crawford's chest was capturing history in the making. A single decision that would soon tear through their department, the media, and the very foundation of trust between police and the people they served. Edmund complied without a word. He opened the car door, the metal creaking softly under the streetlight. The night air was cool against his skin as he stepped out. 6 feet tall, calm, and composed, the kind of presence that commanded quiet without effort. His movements were deliberate, his posture straight. Years of training and leadership were evident in the way he carried himself. Crawford, standing a few feet away, adjusted his grip on the flashlight. He was shorter, younger, but the badge on his chest gave him a temporary illusion of superiority. His shoulders were tight, his breathing shallow. To him, every small hesitation felt like a challenge, every calm question like defiance. "Turn around and place your hands on the car," he ordered sharply. Edmund hesitated, just a fraction of a second, not in rebellion, but in confusion. "Officer," he said evenly, "may I ask what this is about? You've already confirmed my license and registration. I haven't done anything wrong." That one question, that calm, reasonable question, shattered Crawford's composure. He mistook patience for provocation. He saw control in the older man's voice and interpreted it as mockery. His pride wouldn't allow someone to sound more authoritative than him. Without warning, Crawford grabbed Edmund's arm, twisting it upward and forcing him against the car door. The metal thudded under the impact. Edmund flinched, not in resistance, but from sheer surprise. "Stop resisting," Crawford barked. "I'm not resisting," Edmund said firmly, his voice low but steady. "Officer, you're making a—" Before he could finish, Crawford shoved him harder. The body cam on his chest caught every second. The strain in his jaw, the anger in his grip, the imbalance between authority and restraint. Then, in one sudden motion, Crawford swept his leg behind Edmund's knees. The older man lost balance instantly. His weight hit the ground with a heavy, sickening thud that echoed down the street. His head struck the pavement first, the sound dull but unmistakable. For a moment, everything went still, except for the faint groan that escaped Edmund's throat. Blood began to trickle from a small cut near his temple, spreading slowly across the concrete. Crawford didn't notice, or didn't care. Adrenaline blinded him. He pressed his knee into Edmund's back and cuffed him roughly, shouting orders to a man who was no longer resisting, no longer even trying to move. "Hands behind your back. Stop moving." The irony, of course, was that Edmund couldn't move. The shock from the impact had left him dazed, breathless. After a few seconds, Crawford grabbed his radio. His voice trembled with false confidence. "Dispatch, this is Unit 14. Suspect resisted arrest. In custody." But the truth, the undeniable truth, was still being recorded on his chest camera. There was no resistance, no aggression, only a man obeying orders until violence turned obedience into silence. Minutes passed. The rain that had stopped earlier began again, soft and cold, washing faint streaks of red off the pavement. Crawford stood, breathing hard, scanning the scene as if searching for justification. His mind replayed what just happened, trying to shape it into something reasonable. But deep down he already knew. Something had gone terribly wrong. He turned to search the vehicle, perhaps looking for anything that could explain or excuse what he'd done. The flashlight beam swept over the leather seats, the dashboard, and the folder resting on the passenger seat. Papers spilled slightly from the side. He picked them up, flipping through them absent-mindedly, until his eyes caught the heading printed in bold letters at the top. Chief Williams, discussion points. For a long second, Crawford didn't move. The words stared back at him like a mirror. His pulse quickened, the flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He looked back toward the police cruiser, where the man he'd just taken down sat bleeding, handcuffed, silent. His mind tried to reject what his eyes confirmed, that the man in the back seat wasn't a criminal, wasn't a suspect, wasn't some random stranger. He was the chief of police, his boss, his superior, the very man whose name hung in gold on the wall of the station. Crawford's mouth went dry. His flashlight lowered, the light falling away from the papers. He whispered to himself, barely audible, "No, it can't be." But the name on the license matched the name on the document. The ID number, the signature, everything. He staggered back a step, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it echo in his ears. His entire body went cold. For a moment, he considered what to do. Release him? Call it in? Hide it? But there was no hiding this. The body cam was still recording. Every second of panic, every drop of blood, every mistake. He turned toward the cruiser, staring through the window at the man he'd just arrested. Edmund sat upright, even in pain, his breathing heavy but measured. Blood ran down his cheek, catching the flash of blue and red lights. His expression wasn't angry, just disappointed. The kind of disappointment that cuts deeper than rage. Crawford opened the car door slowly, his voice cracking. "Chief, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know it was you." Edmund lifted his eyes, meeting the younger officer's gaze. His voice, though weak, was still firm. "You shouldn't have to know who I am to treat me with respect." Those words hit harder than any punishment ever could. Crawford froze, shame flooding his face as the reality of what he'd done settled like a weight on his chest. The flashing lights reflected in his glassy eyes. Red, blue, red, blue, like a silent judgment from the very system he had sworn to serve. And somewhere in the distance, sirens began to wail. Not for the arrest Crawford thought he'd made, but for the consequences he had just unleashed. Crawford's hands trembled as he fumbled with the keys, the metal clinking against the car door. Panic surged through him like electricity. He yanked the back door open, his voice shaking, his throat dry. "Chief, I didn't know. I swear I didn't." Edmund sat slumped in the back seat, his wrists cuffed, blood streaking down the side of his face. His expression was unreadable. Not rage, not fear, just cold, measured disappointment. His breathing was slow but heavy, every inhale steady and deliberate, as if he was forcing himself to stay composed. "Call your supervisor," Edmund said, his voice firm and low. "And an ambulance. Now." Crawford froze, his mind spinning. For a few seconds, he didn't move, part disbelief, part fear of what was about to happen. He could already see his career flashing before his eyes. Suspension, internal review, the humiliation of facing the department. He had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. "Now, officer," Edmund barked, snapping him out of it. "Yes, sir," Crawford blurted, his voice cracking. He grabbed his radio and stumbled a few steps back toward his patrol car. "Dispatch, this is Unit 14. I need immediate medical assistance at my location. Officer injury. Possible head injury. Suspect, individual, is Chief Williams. Repeat, Chief Edmund Williams. The silence that followed on the radio was deafening. Then came a voice, calm, controlled but tense. Copy that. Unit 14. Supervisor and medics en route. Within minutes, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air again. This time, not for Edmund, but for Crawford's mistake. Sergeant Lisa Valdez was the first to arrive. A seasoned officer in her 40s, she carried the kind of authority that came without raising her voice. When she stepped out of her cruiser and saw the scene, the flashing lights, the broken glass on the pavement, the chief of police sitting handcuffed and bleeding in the back of a patrol car, her face drained of color. "What the hell happened here?" she demanded. Crawford stammered. It was a misunderstanding. I didn't realize." She didn't let him finish. "You what? You didn't realize who he was?" She hurried to the car, opening the door gently. "Chief Williams, sir. I'm so sorry." Edmund looked at her, his voice calm but cutting. "Get these cuffs off me, Sergeant." Without hesitation, Valdez removed them, her hand steady but her heart racing. She noticed the swelling around Edmund's left eye, the cut on his temple, and the tear in his hoodie where the pavement had scraped his shoulder. Blood had soaked slightly into the fabric of his collar. She turned toward Crawford, fury flashing in her eyes. "Do you have any idea who this man is?" Crawford could barely look at her. His words came out small. "I do now." Moments later, paramedics arrived. Edmund refused a stretcher, but allowed them to check his vitals. He insisted on walking to the ambulance himself. Crawford stood nearby, silent, his stomach in knots. The reality was sinking in. Every second of the encounter had been recorded. There was no way to spin it, no excuse that would make sense. At the hospital, Edmund was treated for a mild concussion, cuts, and bruises along his jaw and shoulders. He was discharged just before dawn. By morning, the entire department was in uproar. Word spread faster than any official report could contain. Officers whispered in hallways, group chats buzzed, and the story leaked before anyone could stop it. Some officers shook their heads, saying they weren't surprised. Crawford's temper had always been a problem. Others said this was karma, that his arrogance had finally caught up with him. But a few, the more reflective ones, admitted quietly that the incident was bigger than one man's mistake. It was a mirror, showing them how broken things had become. Later that day, the footage was reviewed in a closed meeting attended by senior officers, internal affairs, city attorneys, and the mayor. The room was silent as the video played on the large monitor. The only sound was the chief's calm voice, the young officer's angry shouts, and finally, the sickening thud of the fall. When the video ended, no one spoke. The mayor leaned forward, visibly shaken. This is going to be a public nightmare," she said quietly. One of the city attorneys asked the question everyone was thinking. "Chief, do you want us to keep the footage internal? We can handle this quietly until—" Edmund interrupted before he could finish. "No, release it." The room went still. "With all due respect, sir," said the attorney carefully, "once that footage is out, the media will." "If it were anyone else," Edmund said, his tone sharp but calm, "that video would already be online. The same rule applies to me. No exceptions." There was no argument after that. 5 days later, the footage was made public. Within hours, it went viral. Major networks picked it up. Social media exploded. Hashtags trended across the country. Millions watched in disbelief as the chief of police, the man tasked with enforcing accountability, became the victim of his own department's failure. Comments poured in. If this can happen to a police chief, one person wrote, what chance do the rest of us have? Civil rights leaders called it proof of a systemic rot that ran deeper than any policy or promise. This isn't about one bad officer, one activist said at a press conference. It's about a culture that protects power until power turns on itself. Protests followed in several cities, not just for Chief Williams, but for every unnamed person whose story didn't come with a badge or a title. And somewhere in the midst of all the chaos, Edmund sat in his office, his injuries healing, but his resolve sharper than ever. He knew that sometimes justice doesn't begin with a courtroom. Sometimes it begins with a camera and the courage to tell the truth, even when it costs you everything. Internal affairs moved fast, faster than anyone in the department had seen before. By sunrise the next morning, Officer Crawford had been relieved of duty pending investigation. His badge, gun, and ID were taken from him right there in the office, under the quiet but watchful eyes of his fellow officers. He didn't argue, didn't speak, just stood there, shoulders slumped, staring down at the cold linoleum floor as the realization hit him like a second arrest. The silence in that room said everything. The unspoken acknowledgement that his career, his reputation, and everything he'd worked for had just ended in one reckless night. By the end of the week, after a rapid but thorough review, Crawford was officially terminated. A few days later, formal charges followed: assault, battery, and filing a false police report. The district attorney's office didn't hold back. They released a statement to the press, calling the incident a breach of public trust at the highest level. Reporters swarmed the courthouse, demanding interviews. But Crawford kept his head low, saying nothing as cameras flashed and microphones were shoved in his face. In court, the prosecution didn't need flowery words or fiery speeches. They didn't need witnesses who could twist the story. All they needed was a screen and a single video file. When the body cam footage played for the jury, the courtroom fell silent. The grainy night vision showed everything. The calm composure of Chief Edmund Williams, the unnecessary aggression, the shove, the fall, and finally, the sound that made the room collectively flinch. That dull, heavy impact of a man's head hitting the pavement. Then the shouting, the chaos. Crawford yelling, "Stop resisting," while the chief lay motionless, barely breathing. It was damning. It was undeniable. The defense tried to twist the narrative. They claimed Crawford had acted out of fear, that the suspect's movements were suspicious, that he feared for his safety. But even as his lawyer spoke, Crawford sat there, staring blankly at the screen, replaying the moment in his own mind. He knew the truth. Everyone in that courtroom did. When the verdict was read, the room was heavy with emotion. Guilty, the foreman announced. On all counts. Crawford didn't react. No outburst, no tears. Just a slow, defeated exhale, like a man finally accepting the weight of his own actions. The judge, an older woman with decades of experience, took a moment before speaking. She looked directly at Crawford and said, "When those with power use it to harm instead of protect, they don't just break the law, they break the trust that holds our communities together." Those words would later be quoted in newspapers and speeches across the country. Crawford was sentenced to 19 months in state prison. He served every day of it, and when he got out, he found that the world had moved on. The badge he once wore now a symbol of shame. No department would hire him. His name had become a warning, not a title. Meanwhile, Chief Edmund Williams returned to duty after a short recovery. But he wasn't the same man. The scar above his eyebrow remained, a quiet reminder of the night everything changed. He walked into his office with a new purpose, not to lead by rank, but by reform. He ordered an overhaul of the complaint review system, ensuring that every citizen's report, no matter how small, would be logged and reviewed by an independent panel. He made de-escalation training mandatory for every officer, from rookies to veterans. And perhaps most powerfully, he implemented anonymous public reporting, allowing people to submit concerns about police behavior without fear of retaliation. Within a year, the department saw a sharp rise in complaints. At first, the media criticized it. Headlines screamed, "Complaints triple under Chief Williams." But Edmund stood firm. When asked if the numbers concerned him, he replied, "No, they show that people finally believe they'll be heard." And he was right. Public trust began to rebuild, slowly but surely. Officers who once felt untouchable started to think before raising their voice or their hand. The department, once defensive and rigid, began to change. Years later, at his retirement ceremony, Edmund stood before a crowd of officers, city officials, and community leaders. The applause was long and sincere. Cameras flashed. A young reporter stepped forward, holding out a microphone. "Chief Williams," she asked, "after everything you've seen, everything you've done, what moment defined your career?" Edmund paused. His hand instinctively rose to the small scar above his eyebrow. His gaze drifted for a moment, as though he were replaying that long night in his mind. Then he said quietly, "The night one of my own officers put me in handcuffs. It taught me that titles don't protect you from abuse of power, and they shouldn't." The room went still. You could feel the weight of those words settle on every uniform there. That same body cam footage, once a symbol of shame, is now part of the curriculum in police academies across the country. Every recruit watches it. Every instructor discusses it. And every time the video plays, the same lesson echoes in the room. Authority means nothing without accountability. Years after his retirement, Edmund Williams would occasionally receive letters from officers he'd trained, from citizens who'd seen the footage, even from Crawford himself. The letters all said the same thing in different words. "Your story changed how I see the badge." And that, Edmund would tell anyone who asked, was worth every scar he carried. If this story made you stop, even for a second, to think about what justice really means, share it. Because stories like this don't just expose what's broken. They remind us of what must never be forgotten. That true power isn't in control. It's in doing what's right, even when no one's watching. If you found this story inspiring, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss another powerful video. Thanks for watching.